In today's overview, why does Germany suffer more than the rest of the EU in the absence of Russian gas? Despite the war in Ukraine, the EU imports more Russian wheat. Why are German politicians considering the possibility of canceling benefits for Ukrainian refugees? In anticipation of the European Parliament elections, the FDP candidate for the European Parliament loses her temper at an election rally. What do Italians think about the crisis in the Middle East? What does Orban mean by saying that Ukraine is no longer a sovereign state? Ukrainian morale continues to dwindle. New Russian trade routes in Asia. Josep Borrel's harsh message to Israel. What drew Russia and China closer together according to the US? What ensures the rapid growth of the Russian economy? And Israel's reaction to Turkey's intention to send the Freedom Flotilla to the Gaza Strip. Why does Germany suffer more than the rest of the EU in the absence of Russian gas? Since the beginning of the war, the consequences for Germany have been palpable. Almost no gas has been supplied from Russia. This burden falls not only on industry, but also on people's wallets. Sebastian Dullien, an economist at the Hans Beckler Foundation, tried to calculate this question for ARD's Panorama magazine. The result: Germany's GDP shrank significantly more than other countries as a result of the war. It lost 5% of its GDP. On a per capita basis, Germans lose an average of about 2,600 euros per year. The EU average is about 880 euros. Thus, the losses of Germans are on average almost 3 times higher than those of other EU citizens. Germany has several structural features that made it particularly vulnerable. We have a very large industrial sector. This means that we consume a lot of energy. Secondly, most of this energy comes from Russia in the form of gas. And thirdly, the German government intervened in the gas markets relatively late. All this combined leads to the fact that Germany finds itself in a particularly difficult situation, says Dullien. Despite the war in Ukraine, the EU imports more Russian wheat. In recent months, Russian farmers have harvested a record amount of grain. If everything continues as it was last year, most of this crop will end up in the EU. Imports of Russian wheat to EU member states in 2023 almost doubled compared to the previous year. Russian grain exports continue to grow, and it is unlikely that this will change in the near future. Forecasts show that Russia will remain the dominant supplier of wheat on the world market, researchers from the Leibniz Institute for Agricultural Development concluded. Why are German politicians considering the possibility of canceling benefits for Ukrainian refugees? Julia Kleckner, spokeswoman for economic policy of the CDU and CSU parliamentary faction, said in an interview with Focus Online, "We must realize that Germany has the lowest employment rate among Ukrainians in the EU. One of the reasons for this is probably the citizen income. This should be reconsidered." Kleckner argues that there is also dissatisfaction among the population that refugees are receiving citizen income. The main goal, as a rule, should be employment of citizens. Former EU Commissioner Günther Oettinger also believes that it is very justified to apply the general law on benefits to Ukrainian refugees. In anticipation of the European Parliament elections, the FDP candidate for the European Parliament loses her temper at an election rally. The FDP ratings are falling. The Liberals fell short of the 5% barrier. By comparison, in the 2021 federal election, the party still had 11.5%. Now the European elections are just around the corner. Marie-Agnes Strack-Zimmermann was nominated by the European Liberals as the main candidate a few months ago. Strack-Zimmermann is a member of the FDP Presidium and chairman of the Defense Committee. The politician went on a tour dedicated to the elections to the European Parliament, which will be held on June 9th. She also visited Ravensburg, where the scandal occurred. Ms. Strack-Zimmermann began insulting the demonstrators and was filmed. The video got on the internet and caused a storm of indignation against the Liberal. About 300 people gathered in front of a small stage on the Marienplatz in Ravensburg. However, these were not FDP supporters or friends of Strack-Zimmermann, but mostly protesters who successfully drowned out the politician's speech with whistles. According to the media, they repeatedly shouted the words "warmongers" and the slogan "Create a world without weapons." What do Italians think about the crisis in the Middle East? The crisis in the Middle East is at the center of discussions between foreign ministers at the G7 summit in Capri and 27 European leaders at a meeting in Brussels. The priority is to prevent an escalation of the conflict. Italians agree with this, but there is concern and, above all, dissatisfaction with the role that the European Union has assumed. Many are calling on the European Union for more active mediation and diplomatic skills, but they do not hide their fear of a conflict directly affecting Italy and Europe. The common defense that many European leaders are increasingly referring to is starting to seem indispensable. What does Orban mean by saying that Ukraine is no longer a sovereign state? Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban spoke at a conservative conference in Brussels. He stated that Ukraine can no longer be recognized as an independent country. According to him, this is due to the complete dependence on aid coming from the United States and the European Union. Orban explained his thesis as follows: Ukraine is now only a protectorate of the West. Therefore, without receiving money and weapons from the EU and the US, Ukraine as a state will cease to exist. According to the Hungarian Prime Minister, a buffer zone should be created between NATO countries and Russia. Ukraine could act as such a zone. Motivating his proposal, Orban recalled the Kremlin's words that it will not tolerate the expansion of the North Atlantic Alliance towards Russia. Ukrainian morale continues to dwindle. About 650,000 men of military age have left Ukraine since the beginning of the war, fleeing conscription. Politico reports in an article describing the decline in morale in Ukrainian society. The weakening of sentiment is due to insufficient supplies of ammunition and inadequate support from the West, the portal notes. In an interview with Politico, Ukrainian Foreign Minister Dmitry Kuleba noted that Ukraine is falling into a vicious cycle. Supplies of the necessary weapons are either insufficient or stopped, so Ukraine is weakening. Western countries will say that Ukraine is retreating, and therefore further deliveries may not take place, the head of the Ukrainian Foreign Ministry explained. Politico journalists spoke with officers of the Ukrainian army, who informed them that the front could collapse this summer. The greatest threat is the expected Russian offensive. New Russian trade routes in Asia. Russia continues to build 2 new transport corridors linking Asia and Europe, seeking to ease sanctions over the war in Ukraine, while unrest in the Middle East disrupts global trade. The maritime and railway networks passing through Iran, as well as the Arctic Sea Passage, may strengthen Moscow's orientation towards Asian powers, China and India, rather than Europe. They have the potential to put Russia at the center of much of international trade, even as the US and its allies try to isolate President Vladimir Putin. Josep Borrel's harsh message to Israel. In addition to his comments condemning Iran's attack on Israel, EU Foreign Policy Chief Josep Borrel criticized Israel for being slow in fulfilling promises to increase aid to Gaza. Borrell called on the world not to forget about Gaza and said that regional stability is impossible until the war ends there. He called for an immediate and sustainable ceasefire and added that discussions should focus on the release of hostages and the humanitarian situation. What drew Russia and China closer together, according to the US? The strengthening of the China-Russia axis, according to the United States, is one of the dramatic geopolitical consequences of the war in Ukraine. The US is concerned about the deepening of Sino-Russian relations, which affects the course of the war in Ukraine, writes Le Monde. The world has changed. There is no longer a center that can dictate a model of behavior to other countries. The relationship between Russia and China has significantly strengthened these states. The US will have to treat Russia and China as equals. What ensures the rapid growth of the Russian economy? According to the forecasts of the IMF, the growth rate of the Russian economy this year will be higher than that of all other developed countries of the world, including the US, writes Chennik. Russia has rebuilt its economy and strengthened trade relations with the countries of the Asia-Pacific region, which see it as a more reliable ally than Europe. Russia has achieved success thanks to an independent economic policy, while the leaders of European countries are leading their states to complete ruin under pressure from the United States. Israel's reaction to Turkey's intention to send the Freedom Flotilla to the Gaza Strip. Turkey intends to send humanitarian aid to Gaza Strip. The Israeli government is actively trying to convince officials in Ankara to stop this action and prevent a possible conflict between the countries. Turkey will use 2 passenger ships and 1 cargo ship loaded with humanitarian aid. According to plans, about 1,200 people will be on board, including activists, journalists, Turkish parliamentarians, and public figures. Ways to prevent this action without resorting to the seizure of ships by the Israel Defense Forces are being actively discussed in Jerusalem. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs has recently appealed to a number of countries to intervene. Israel also appealed to the US and the UK, and their diplomatic representatives conveyed a message to their Turkish counterparts, Cursor Info writes. Israel's action in Gaza have led to a humanitarian catastrophe. However, Israel actively prevents the transfer of humanitarian supplies to the population. Such a humanitarian action by Turkey is an attempt to break the blockade. The situation with the Freedom Flotilla is another illustration of the split in the NATO bloc.